Hi everyone, this is Sia D. Clayton, Head of Content here at Goodlord. The following podcast is a recording of a webinar we held 2 days after the Renters Reform Bill's second reading. You'll hear from lettings legislation expert and Managing Director of Insurance at Goodlord, Ollie Sherlock, and he'll be joined by Ryan Heaven, Solicitor at Dutton Gregory. So without further ado, on with the podcast.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this week's instalment of the Renters Reform Bill webinar series, the long-lasting Renters Reform Bill webinar series. Who knew things could last this long? But indeed, the bill process is. It's a pleasure to be joined today by Ryan Heaven, a solicitor at Dutton Gregory. You may remember Ryan. He's joined us a couple of times before to discuss this very subject. Good morning, Ryan. How are you?
Morning, Ollie. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I'm very good. Thank you so much for joining us this morning in this half an hour special, I suppose, on the back of the second reading of the Renters Reform Bill, which of course happened on Monday. It's been a busy sort of 48 hours since, I suppose. You were at the NRLA conference, I think, yesterday, seeing the one and only Michael Gove speaking, right?
Yeah, indeed. So we a fair few people in this webinar may well have watched the parliamentary proceedings live on Monday. I know I did. Stayed up all night with my popcorn, and we got a little bit extra information from Michael Gove, but it was also quite helpful to obviously feel like what the word on the street was. What did the landlords and members of the NRLA think about what had happened the previous day? And they got a chance to give Michael a bit of a grilling.
And indeed, this process is moving forwards. Finally, there was a bit of a lull at one stage, which we're going to cover. But either way, there is a level of progress being happened, and that's exactly what we're here to talk about today. We've also got Stephanie and Danielle helping support on the slides. If we have any technical problems, as always, we'll try and rejoin as quickly as possible, so please do bear with us. The Q&A is open, so please feel free to ask Ryan and I any questions around the Renters Reform Bill or the potential changes, and we'll try our best to answer them. If we can go on to the next slide, please, guys. So in terms of this webinar, this is focused on the Renters Reform Bill, of course. For those of you who don't know about Goodlord, though, a quick 10 seconds, we are a pre-tenancy business that has produced a piece of PropTech software that helps make you more efficient and expedite that pre-tenancy process to ensure you can focus on the things that really matter, giving excellent customer service and generating revenue and supplying growth for both your business and indeed your customers. If you want to understand more about our platform in terms of how it can help you combine landlord terms of business, contract generation, deposit registration, rent collection, and indeed other products like rent protection insurance, then please do visit our website at www.goodlord.co, where you can book a demonstration. These sessions aren't about Goodlord. They're about understanding sort of change in the market. So if we go to the next slide, please, let's look at what we're going to cover today. We're going to cover with Ryan the first thoughts on the second reading, understanding exactly what the initial sort of summary is. We're then going to drill down and focus on Section 21, a subject that's been close to all of our hearts for many months now. We're going to understand exactly what's happening with Section 21 following the government announcements in the last few days. And then we're going to touch on briefly how agents can start preparing. Obviously, given the limited progress, there's not much to cover, but we're going to try and sort of give you a few pointers. And as I say, the Q&A is open from the very start. And we've already got a few questions in. So we'll come to those shortly. We're going to start the first slide if we can. And then I'll come to those first two. But again, please do get your questions into the chat if you want anything answering. So Ryan, give me your sort of 101 on this. What's your first thought in terms of the your summary of what you've seen in the last sort of 48 odd hours?
Well, I didn't think it would take this long to get this far, to be honest. The bill enjoys cross-party support. And something we're probably going to say more than once during this webinar is that this bill is going to pass in some form or another because both the government and Labour support it. The real question is what it's going to look like. The reason why it took so far, I think there's been some speculation about it, but it seems as though the Conservatives have been trying to wrangle some backbenchers who may be opposed to this bill back on side, and there have been some concessions which we're going to be talking about, I think, in the very next slide. There is some extra meat on the bone, but it's important to stress that we don't really have anything written down. It might help if I just provide a bit of a legislative breakdown to say we are here and what we can possibly expect next. I'll do it as quickly as I can with one eye on the clock. Essentially, what's happened in the 5 months since we got the first bill is the government's simply been, and the opposition and the backbenchers and the select committee, which is a group of 11 MPs who scrutinise the Levelling Up Department's legislation. They've all been working on what they think could be done differently with the bill. And we're going to see that fleshed out in the next stages. So we've had the government's response to that, the select committee's questions about it, and that's what's generated things like the Section 21 being delayed, some new information about antisocial behaviour, a little bit more information about student lets, which we didn't have previously. But what happens next is amendments come in from the government, from the opposition, from backbenchers, from the select committee, and that's where this bill is going to get added to. So the next stage, the third reading, is going to be what amendments are going to be made. I did hear a rumour at the NRLA conference that this is going to be pushed through the House of Commons, so the third reading should take place before Christmas. I can't reveal my sources and take all that with a pinch of salt, bearing in mind how long it took to get here. But if we get the third reading, we should at least know what the final-ish version is going to look like, because after that it goes to the House of Lords, and the House of Lords should just pass it because it's a manifesto commitment. The Convention's House of Lords respects that the government should just be able to pass its flagship policies. But there are landlords in the House of Lords. There could be a rebellion. We don't know yet. So, we should hopefully at least get something in writing before Christmas, and that will allow us to maybe provide a bit more information, maybe a fourth episode. Who knows?
And to the sort of lull point and the supposed challenge from backbenchers, would it be ridiculous to suggest that, given that this has cross-party support, was part of the manifesto, that actually the challenge has been relatively small, given that there's already been a commitment to push this through? And actually, the reason why we've seen a lack of activity and progress on this over the last, frankly, 40 odd years is because it's not a priority for the government. It's something that they have struggled to actually get their heads around in terms of how to really meet the demands of a quite complicated sector, which maybe they didn't appreciate to begin with. And one could argue that actually this has come down the pecking list on priorities when you look at things like COVID, for example, other initiatives that the government clearly feel more strongly about and seem to find good taglines for. This has not been one of them. And actually, this has been a lower priority. And now we're seeing the results of the lack of prioritisation ahead of a general election in trying to tick the manifesto box. Could one argue that, Ryan? I mean, it feels to me like there's substance in that.
Not only could you argue it, I completely agree with you. It feels like a checklist exercise where they say we said we were going to pass this legislation before the end of our government. We've done that, and even if that means delaying more or less every single part of that legislation for a future government to decide whether or not they want to keep it. So like you say, this is going to get passed. It's probably going to get passed before the next election. And I think the main reason for deferring everything is to enable it to be passed so that they can say that they passed it, even if everything follows on later.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of truth in that. And I would heed caution to playing with something that has a huge effect on people's lives and an industry that is actually, I think, very proactive in supporting people in homes, especially when you look at the letting agent sort of centric part of the industry. And this level of inactivity and then rushed progress, I would argue, is not helpful for anybody. And isn't actually serving the very people we're trying to help, which of course is tenants. This bill is focused on supporting and giving a better framework for tenants. And ultimately, it's hard to see how we're doing that at the moment. And that as well is a good segue on to student tenancies. Of course, there's a large student demographic across the UK. We proudly have fantastic universities up and down the country. And in the white paper, there's the action around purpose-built student accommodation was noted. Now, we talked earlier, and you said it wasn't actually pointed out in the first draft of the bill. So we have had more information on this, but it's essentially doubling down, isn't it, on a white paper note that was included initially.
Yeah, so the idea is that with the government doing away with fixed term tenancies, student landlords rely quite heavily on knowing that the tenants that they've got are going to leave in June, July, so that the property could be empty, ready to be occupied again in September. And that there was some talk about it being in this legislation, but it didn't make it into the first part of the bill. The word student appears just once, and it's not in the context of this. But the idea that's been put forward is that purpose-built student accommodation providers, so large developers, will be able to create fixed-term contracts. And the obvious question there is, well, what about everybody else? And this was certainly discussed at the NRLA conference, where, as you can imagine, not a great deal of developers there. You've got a great deal of landlords who are letting out their homes to students, though. And the concession there seems to be that there will be a new Section 8 ground introduced that would allow landlords of students to give some kind of notice, maybe to coincide with the end of term. There's no detail at all on that, so really I can't advise anything else about it other than, in principle, it seems like there's going to be some concession to student landlords who are not these major developers.
Okay. It feels like the challenge that was raised from the very start since the white paper hasn't been listened to on this. And it is potentially dangerous, right, for a number of landlords, thousands of landlords actually, in terms of wanting certainty. And I appreciate there is a level of certainty on the fact that we know exactly what they're going to do from a purpose-built perspective. I think there's probably still hope there's going to be some level of detail that emerges that helps non-purposeful student accommodation. Although at the moment, it doesn't look likely from any noise that's coming out of the government. I know. Probably within the last year, the NRLA felt that they'd won that challenge. That actually, there was going to be a reversal of the of those terms, but it doesn't look like there will be. We've got quite a few questions in, so let me cover these. I've got a question from somebody who didn't leave their name, but good morning to you nonetheless. They ask, if you lease your property to an independent third party, will you have to registered as this bill makes a requirement? I do not issue tenancy agreements. It's all down to the third party, nor do I have any housing management functions under my control. I would welcome any views.
Blimey, that's a really good question. To answer that, I'm quite happy to keep one eye on the legislation. So if I were to look at the bill, I could probably find the answer to this before the end of this webinar. But off the top of my head, it's a good question. I think you'd still be. My instinct is you're still a landlord, even if you've got no responsibility for it. Because you are the landlord of that company. So let me come back to you on that one. Great question. I've not been asked it yet.
I really wished you'd left your name, because I could then say that so-and-so stumped Ryan Heaven on the webinar, which has yet to happen. Well done, whoever you are. Good morning, Sean. Sean asks, I know fixed terms are being removed, but can there be a minimum term?
No. Actually, let me think about it. I think these are questions I have not been asked yet, and I like them a lot. I'm going to come back to you on both of them. I'm sorry not to be able to answer them straight away, but maybe that's because it was a really good question.
Yeah, let's try and come back to that. It flies in the face of the point of the change, I suppose, on the basis that you have a monthly, essentially rolling contract under the assured terms. But if both parties were in agreement, I'm going to leave that one with you.
It says, so I can answer that fixed term one maybe a bit quicker, because the idea of the legislation is that it does away with terms. It simply the amended legislation. The bill, subject to change, of course, says terms of an assured short-hold tenancy are to be of no effect, insofar as they provide for the tenancy to be a fixed-term tenancy. So would a minimum term create a fixed term? I don't think any of these things. So, for example, a fixed-term tenancy isn't fleshed out in the legislation. Good, you're picking holes in it. I like it a lot. I don't think the bill provides the answer to that question.
And indeed, that is the hope, isn't it? Between now and the bill is introduced, that we have that level of clarity, because there's quite a few areas actually that you could pick holes in, and we've covered them on the previous two sessions that we've done at length in terms of trying to understand exactly where we can have clarity. But any more confirmation on that through this session, Ryan, would be great. Sean, we'll pass your details on to Ryan as well. And please do feel reach out back out to the Lord if with any further questions. Let's focus, if we can, on Section 21. We've had many a webinar where we've tried to not talk about Section 21 at all, because it's all we talked about for some time. So it's ironic in some ways that this section has reared its head again and is now the focal point of this bill. It was always going to be, I suppose. Right, talk us through what have the government said around Section 21, because there's been a bit of a change, right?
Yeah, so the idea is that the government are going to delay the implementation of the ban on Section 21 until such a time as the courts are up to speed. Michael Gove said that 95% of courts are meeting a certain standard, and I think that certain standard is that the courts has to have a hearing of a claim within 8 weeks of the claim being issued. However, there's absolutely no time frames for what happens after that hearing. And anyone who's gone through the court process will know that first hearing is a 5-minute hearing. And if there's any kind of defence at all, then it will get adjourned. So 95% of courts are already meeting that test. So they must feel that they maybe need to get to 100% of that before they can feel like the courts are up to speed. Or maybe there's some other nebulous threshold. But the problem here is it's so vague as to effectively, indefinitely kick this into touch, I think, because there doesn't seem to be, at least not yet, any kind of arbitrary marker which just says this is the point at which we consider courts to be up to speed. When's it going to happen? It's just a classic how long is a piece of string. So to answer the question on screen, is this a delay or a U-turn? I think it's essentially a U-turn, because they have kicked it so far into touch that this is the next government's problem, and they can decide whether or not they want to go through with the Section 21 ban or not. They're washing their hands of it, I think.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting point. You and I sort of disagree slightly on this. I think clearly it's a delay tactic. I actually think it's exactly what's required. I think the legal process when it comes to housing is fundamentally broken. It's archaic. It's slow. It is complex beyond the point of needing to be. And I think this is exactly the right call if you're going to introduce the measures that have been deemed under the bill to be needed. Now, without that investment, without that change, it is impossible. The courts it's impossible for courts to manage these processes at the volume they will have. Because, of course, the device to complete an action now sits within the legal process, not outside of it, if this bill comes in force and Section 21 is abolished. So I don't fundamentally disagree with your point. However, I hope, and goodness me, I'm talking about politics and hope. I hope that no matter which party are in power, that if they're going to deliver this, they're going to deliver it with a court system that is digitalized, that is efficient, that focuses on the quickest point of outcome. Because if they don't, they will drown, and they will create a cumbersome and horrible process, not only for landlords, because the focus should be on them at that stage. If there's a breach of agreement, you've breached a contract, but also for tenants. Delays in the legal process, and this is what's fundamentally missed sometimes by the parties here. Delays in the legal process create more excessive debt, especially in cases of arrears, for tenants. Just sit in the property, wait there. Now, if the legal process was working as it should, that would be felt, and it would be swift, and it would be efficient for all parties. So this affects both. So I think, I'm not going to go as far to say it's a U-turn. I appreciate it can definitely look like that. But I actually hope that this happens, because it's a long time coming. Even through COVID, we were told there's going to be Nightingale courts and we're going to expedite process. It didn't happen. And we're still feeling the after effects of it.
It seems daft to me that the banning of Section 21 was almost the whole point of this, because no tenant is going to start voting Conservative because there's suddenly a landlord ombudsman. This isn't the only game changer for tenants in this was the banning of Section 21. When it comes to the changes to the court process, I'm totally with you that the court is not fit for purpose. And the main discussion seems to be whether or not there's reinvestment in the current court system, or if there's an entirely separate housing court set up to deal with these things. Either way, money is going to have to be produced, and again, that's a decision for the Treasury to make, not really for Michael Gove. Though I do think it's slightly ironic that Michael Gove, when he was Minister of Justice, was the one cutting funding to all these courts. I think he's at least as much as anyone else responsible for the current situation of the courts systems. It just seems a little bit cheeky that he's suddenly asking for more money to it when he's not actually in a position to control the court budget.
Yeah, I would agree, and that one would call it hypocrisy almost through that process isn't lost to me at all, and you wonder why these things are being pushed, and especially ahead of what we recognise is probably an extremely important general election for the Conservatives, given their current standing and form. And I think, when we talk about changes, it's important for us to understand the detail. And that's exactly what's lacking here, in my view. The governments have come out and said, we can't do this. Stop. Everyone pause. We need to invest in the courts. And most of us go, yeah, we've been saying that for some time. And what? And there's no answer there. There's no real clear steer of exactly what this means. I mean, taking the courts into a digital age is a relatively broad statement. Beverly on the Q&A. Good morning, Beverly. I hope you're well. Asks, how do you think digitalisation of Section 8 eviction will work? It's a bloody good question, Beverly. To begin with, it'd be nice to think that actually the process could be digitalised, let alone become more efficient through serving and different practices in the courts and receiving those in a digital nature. I mean, a lot of what we do from a legal process is still paper-based. It's still manual. Somebody has to look at it. There's no computer reading there. There's no AI involved. So, I think, there's a long way this could go. But of course, to go a long way, it needs big investments. And I think Ryan is right to point out that, is that going to happen in the next 9 months? No, it's probably not. In fact, it's definitely not. Is this a long-term plan? Well, that's hard to say when we have a potential change of government coming down the line. But, to the point of changes, we don't really know, I think, Ryan, of what the government's actually suggesting here, because they've kind of made the broad statement, but given us little detail of what they're actually going to do, going back to your kind of 95% threshold point.
Yeah, there again, I don't know if there's too much more to discuss. I think it's just, I think they've washed their hands of this whole thing.
And so going back to Section 21, Bella, good morning, Bella. I hope you're well. Asks, so do you feel there's a chance this could be passed through into law without the banning of Section 21 being included in it, Ryan?
I think so. So I mentioned earlier about amendments coming from different sources, and this is the government. Michael Gove said that they wanted to do this. So the idea is that the government have a majority in Parliament. So in theory, they should be able to pass any amendment that they want to make to it. So if the government want to defer the introduction of Section 21 notices, they have the power to do that. So yes, it's entirely possible. The final version of this bill will include an amendment which says we're going to more or less defer it for an indefinite period of time. And that there's other parts of this legislation as drafted, which were not fully fleshed out in the first bill, and I don't expect them to be fully fleshed out in the second bill either. You've got bits about the landlord database, and you've got bits about redress scheme, and in the bill it says we're going to flesh those out in future regulations. I think there might be something similar for the Section 21 ban.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And really, it means that we all have to really keep on our toes and keep watching and listening in terms of the progress. And the devil with all of these things is in the detail. And again, sorry, go on, man.
Oh no, it's fine. It was more just to say that I can answer that question from the Q&A earlier today. I've had one eye on the legislation. I had to do some proper reading. So it comes down to the meaning of a residential landlord in the bill. And a residential landlord is a landlord of a relevant tenancy, and a definition of a relevant tenancy is a tenancy which is either an assured tenancy or a rent act tenancy. So if you are letting to a third-party company, a rent-to-rent company, essentially, you wouldn't need to go and register for the. You wouldn't need to be on the landlord register for that purpose. So that's a nice little loophole potentially spotted. Well done, whoever spotted that. Anonymous, you did great.
Yes, indeed. Well done to that person. So looking at these kind of changes, or this delay at best, U-turn at worst. You were, as I want to reflect on your time at the NOLA conference, because it's a good opportunity for you to be on the floor with thousands of landlords, and you get a feeling for the room.
Yeah.
What was your read on the feeling when it comes to this point? What do you think this means to landlords at the moment?
it doesn't change. It doesn't change too much because again, the idea is that landlords who were spooked by this have probably already exited the market, to be honest. And every other landlord was just saying, well, I don't really have complete information to make a decision. A lot of the speakers were saying, don't panic, because at the moment we don't really know anything. We don't know what the law is going to look like. We don't know when it's going to kick in. You may yet have 1, 2, 3, 4, many more years of happy landlording before you feel the need to exit the market. So that's the general idea, is that landlords didn't really know. They were deferring their decision until they knew more.
Yeah, and I think that level of uncertainty drags on. Hopefully, to that point, now we can support and educate landlords that there isn't need for sudden change, and that message of keep calm, carry on letting, I think is still a really relevant one, because ultimately, when you look at the market forces in play at the moment, the demand is there. Landlords are desperately needed. I absolutely buy, though, that landlords are also looking for a level of support from the government. And in the process of this bill coming into law, and all of these things, like Section 21 being introduced, we may well see a change in government too. It's going to be interesting to see how different governments look at landlords and whether they value and support them, or whether they're choosing not to, or indeed keep the status quo as it is. It's there's going to be a lot of change for a number of reasons, right?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I want to reflect on from the NRNA conference was that when Michael Gove gave his speech, which was via Zoom, by the way. He wasn't on stage in the room with a 1,000 angry landlords. Any question that gave him a hard time got quite a resounding cheer from the entire audience. Now, that might have happened under any circumstance, but it suggested to me that this concession to landlords may not have entirely won them back. I thought it was quite telling that they were the loudest claps of the day were the ones where he was really pushed about his decisions and the idea of penalising good landlords, when the aim was obviously to try and clamp down on bad landlords.
I think that's absolutely fair. And ultimately, when you're looking to make this level of substantial change in a market, an industry that essentially supports where people live, which it does, then it should be taken seriously. It should be thought through. And I think, we're talking solely about landlords here. The continued omission of letting agents and their meaningfulness as part of this process bewilders me. I don't understand it. And one can argue, yes, I've got a commercial interest in agents, letting agents. Sure. I've been a letting agent myself. I believe in the process and the role letting agencies play. And the simple fact is that for over half of the market, letting agents will be having to educate landlords on these very points, because they're not at the NRLO conference. They're hands off. They employ someone to do that, and I just think that has been extremely lacking. And I hope that the government sort of starts to work more and more closely with letting agency bodies to help support and understand their role and understand how they can support, because agents play a huge part in this. And indeed, looking to agencies. If we go on to the next slide. It's probably important to touch on, just before we finished, what's next, but also how agents can start preparing. So very quickly, Ryan, just talk us through what the next steps on the bill are, just for everyone to understand.
So yeah, we're going to be getting amendments proposed by the government, opposition, the select committee, backbenchers, and then the third reading is going to be a chance for Parliament to vote on those amendments, and then the amendments will get incorporated into the legislation. That's when we'll probably be there in terms of the final text of it. Then it goes to the House of Lords. House of Lords should rubber stamp it, but you can't count out a rebellion on something like this. And then it will be passed. Now, and again, we have the legislation passing, getting royal assent, is not the same as it coming into force. We've got already within the bill, there's a different date for implementation of certain things. There's a phased introduction from ASTs that exist already into assured tenancies. There's the idea that Section 21 notices would be valid for a certain period of time after implementation date. And then you also have now essentially a third implementation date, which is when are the courts going to be up to speed. So, I mean, that's how it looks. In terms of what agents could do to prepare, I said it in May and I'll say it now. I think you probably need to be reassuring your landlords that it's not the end of the world. A speaker at the NRLA conference said that, and I agree, is that Scotland did away with their equivalent of Section 21 and they still have a PRS. I think it's a fair point that, yes, landlords will have less control over that property, but there's no reason why they couldn't continue to to be landlords for many years in the future.
And I think
so. Yeah, I think it's a PR exercise.
Yeah, there's definitely an element of that, but it's an PR exercise that ultimately affects how letting agents process their business on a daily or weekly, monthly basis. And I think understanding exactly what the effects on your renewal revenue, for example, is as letting agents, with the removal of ASDs and introduction of assured tenancies, building out good long-term strategic levels of service for customers that are maybe future-proof for what we think we know at the moment, will all be proactive things. You will never regret having more substance and more provision to customers in your business if you can manage them well. You will regret not making changes quick enough and being caught, in the wave that comes when the change maybe happens more quickly than we think. And indeed, to Ryan's point, that could be for some of the changes as early as spring next year. So I think, ultimately keeping your landlords educated and providing great customer service. Landlords will struggle to want to leave a sector where their rent is being paid, where they're providing, where they're getting a great level of service from their customers, and they've got good tenants in their properties. And I think agents can play a role in all of that, whether it's through taking rent protection, to supplying, good tenants, or really robust tenants, especially given demand at the moment. There's a role that we can play here to try and keep as many landlords in the sector as possible. So, it's hard though, right, Ryan? It's hard with so little clarity on so many points. It's difficult, and some of the questions really throw up and show where there's lack of clarity. I want to cover a few of these before we finish. Vanessa asks, good morning, Vanessa. Under the removal of the fixed term, would a tenant paying, say, 6 months in advance create a unwritten fixed term? Now, payments in advance is something we've touched on these sessions before, isn't it?
Yeah, you can't take those kind of payments in advance anymore. The most payment you could take would be 1 month. So there isn't really a workaround for that aside from guarantors. I think I might have said it before, is that guarantors are going to be utilised more often, because you usually take those 6 months payments where someone's failed referencing. Here, you either let to them or you don't. And if you do let to them without a guarantor, you just have to take 1 month as you normally would. So, unfortunately, that doesn't create another fixed term of sorts.
And again, somebody who hasn't left their name, but good morning to you nonetheless. Within the draft, they have said about greater terms for antisocial behaviour. Indeed, they have. Have they given any information with what evidence you would need? Would you just give a crime number? That's an excellent question from whoever left that.
So, no, this is a good point, because in the bill, I thought the wording that they used was rubbish. It was a very small semantic
because
change.
It was.
It was. I think it was just a change. Like the change is the behaviour that is causing is causing nuisance, rather than behaviour this is likely to cause antisocial behaviour. But my whole point here is that the ground is a discretionary ground, and so that semantic change doesn't really change the fact that on the day of the hearing, you're going to have to convince a judge that the antisocial behaviour is so serious that they would have to make an order for possession. So I don't think behaviour that fits the category of is capable of causing is going to be the same as behaviour which is actually causing. And it's behaviour that is actually causing antisocial behaviour that is what would tip it over the edge. Now, this is relevant because one of the things Michael Gove said is that it sounds like they're going to make ground 14, which is the nuisance antisocial behaviour ground, into a mandatory ground. Now, that makes it much easier to prove. The idea being is that a discretionary ground, even if you prove that they are the tenants are doing behaviour which is capable of being a nuisance, if you prove that they are doing that, then the court has no discretion at all. So in terms of the threshold of evidence, a police report would be fantastic. Statements from neighbours would be fantastic. The more evidence you've got, the longer the issue has occurred for, the more people you've got complaining about it, the higher the chances of reaching that threshold are. But now, if it's a mandatory ground, it actually seems quite a low bar. Which is really helpful for landlords. So changing it from discretionary to mandatory is absolutely a really big win for landlords. Discretionary grounds are not very helpful.
And indeed, that change, will need to be understood right by letting agent landlords alike to understand exactly what the thresholds are there, albeit mandatory. I think having some clarity to that question is really helpful. To make sure that absolutely the process is followed. And And indeed, tenants aren't discriminated against, etc. So whilst helpful, it's there for a reason, and it's cautious to point out that those guidelines will have to be met. There is a risk with that, isn't it, that it becomes almost a Section 21 light, because one could argue that anybody is capable of anything, and indeed, there's always something that tenants maybe would do that could be deemed as antisocial, music too loud, or slamming a door, or whatever. There's going to have to be a certain level of threshold that people are working towards there.
I think that's been acknowledged by the government, in that a lot of the feedback was that landlords were serving Section 21 notices even if they could have served a Section 8, because why serve notice on it as a discretionary ground where you got no real certainty when you could just serve a Section 21? This seems to be filling that niche of, you would serve a Section 21 currently on these antisocial tenants. Now, in the future, you're likely to have far stronger grounds. You can just go directly for that Section 8 process, which is quicker because it skips the 2-month notice period entirely.
Sure. Yeah, no, definitely. A few more questions and then we are going to finish. We are overrunning already, so apologies, but the questions keep coming in. Stephen, good morning. Stephen asks, what about payment in advance for overseas students? We currently charge the whole term. I think their answer is the same as the one you previously gave, right, Ryan? It's not going to be something that is permissible under the new legislation.
Yeah, it's something that needs to be fleshed out. I completely agree with you. You have these scenarios where taking that kind of level of payment up front is justifiable. And I think I mentioned before that it's a potential loophole. In that if you think of it in the sense of, if you have a tenant who's going to pay rent monthly and they just happen to pay their rent, they just happen to give you a lump sum, they're not paying 6 months rent up front. They're in credit, aren't they? There's nothing to stop a tenant from paying early if they want to. So it seemed to me as a potential workaround from the letter of the law, if not the spirit of the law, was that you just set this up as a 12-month tenancy, but you ask them to pay it all up front. You obviously can't set it up as a 12-month tenancy, but you basically are saying that you have to, the payments are due monthly, but we're going to ask you to pay it all up front, and just see if that makes it into the final legislation, to be honest with you. A loophole in the bill doesn't mean there's going to be a loophole in the legislation.
Or indeed, and indeed, then a loophole at court, which again, if then taken, there'll be case precedents there. So, two very quick last ones. Ashley, good morning, Ashley. From a lettings negotiator standpoint, how would you persuade a landlord to use their local agent instead of managing the property themselves? Some landlords will be trying to cut cost. Ashley, I absolutely sympathise that winning landlords at the moment is probably the hardest thing to do in a long time. I think the reality is, though, that there's more risk in the landlord's world than ever before. And if you listen to the arguments that say there's an exodus of landlords, they point towards this risk. And I would argue that there isn't an exodus just yet. Indeed, there are landlords leaving. And I would suggest that letting agencies protect from that risk. For me, the idea of a letting agent is to bring and deliver peace of mind. And I would argue that letting agents, for a lot of landlords who don't make this their business day to day, have never been so important. So never played such a crucial role. So I would suggest, from an education perspective, not verging on scaremongering, really looking to communicate with the landlord on a basis of what you're going to do to deliver that peace of mind and ensure that their return on investment is as good as guaranteed through the entirety of these changes and thereafter. Because hopefully, having that level of confidence, and most, if not all, investments are based on confidence. Having that confidence means that they will not only find you invaluable, but they'll also continue to be a landlord. And I think, again, to that point, letting agents play such a crucial role in keeping people in this sector. This sector will look very different if we're not careful, and that will absolutely hurt tenants, in my opinion. Tenants need places to live, and because of the inactivity of numerous governments, we don't have enough homes in this country. That's an entire different webinar, which I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. But that would be my advice, Ashley. One for you here to finish us off, Ryan, from Lindsay. Good morning, Lindsay. Private landlord, one property. This year, I have young Chinese business students who paid 1 year advance. They could not meet a reference. How can one proceed in future with this type of tenant? Again, kind of giving a bit more context to the previous point that I think Stephen asked. Ultimately, given what we know now, would Lindsay have to say, I'm sorry that I can't actually rent you the property under the new legislation?
Yeah, indeed. So you have two options really when it comes to foreign students, because if they're foreign students, odds are if they can provide a guarantor, that guarantor will also be foreign based, and that's not very helpful for you. the way to proceed would either be that you just have to take the rent on a monthly basis. There's the potential for a workaround if the legislation is flexible enough to allow rent to be in credit for periods of time. Or the alternative is you simply can't rent to them. Again, I think this is going to be something to scrutinise in the final legislation, because it's a common enough occurrence that it could be factored into the legislation. So again, you have foreign nationals that you're let to. There could be an exception, just like, for example, purpose-built student accommodation providers have got an exception that they can create fixed terms. You might be able to get an exception to taking more rent up front potentially.
Fantastic, thank you so much, Alex. You've missed the buzzer, but I'm going to allow it. One very, very, very quick follow-up question: will existing fixed terms have to lapse onto periodic when they reach the end of their term, or will they immediately become periodics? Indeed, there's guidance in the bill and the paper for the retrospective action. So you'll see assured tenancies coming into place from X date, and there's retrospective action. I think is it with 12 to 18 months thereafter, Ryan? I think I'm right in saying for all other tenancies that would then go into an assured tenancy process.
Yeah, there was this wording of application date and extended application dates. And it's basically, it's very similar to how the Tenant Fees Act was introduced and the Deregulation Act was introduced, where basically existing tenancies are allowed to continue as they are up until a certain point. And either that's usually when the fixed term ends, or there will be a kind of a final backstop period. So, at the moment, we don't know what any of those things are, and we won't know until after the legislation is passed. At the moment, we can't really do any proper planning for that. But the best way of kind of circumnavigating that, if you think that an assured short-haul tenancy is better than a assured tenancy, and most landlords probably would, because it essentially means you can serve a Section 21, then you would want to create maybe as long a fixed term as you possibly can before the application date kicks in. And then you have that assured short-haul tenancy for a much longer period. But again, this is maybe a discussion for us to have next year when we know a little bit more about when those dates are likely to be.
Yeah, this feels very like Chelsea signing long-term contracts to get around financial fair play if we're not careful. We've got to make sure that we understand that process, I think, before we
amortize for tenancy over 10 years.
Do not start writing long tenancies just on that basis. Ryan, thank you as always for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure. To everybody that's been watching this morning or enjoying listening in to the recording and the podcast, and thank you so much for taking the time. I hope this sort of brief webinar and update on the Renters Reform Bill has been helpful. If you want to understand more about the Renters Reform Bill, indeed your staff do, we have a Renters Reform Bill course that you can take. It's CPD certified, and indeed can be found on our website. But for now, that's all we have time for. Ryan, thank you. To everyone else, have a fantastic day, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.